My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development, and I'm also the editor of the report. For those who are familiar with the report, it offers a comprehensive strategic assessment of the political, military, and humanitarian dimension of active conflict worldwide. Provides a lot of in-depth analysis on the drivers and dynamics of today's war. There is a great deal of material and many important insights to explore. And I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of friends, experts, and colleagues who will help us unpack all those different conflict trends and development around the world. I will just introduce them in order of in speaking order. Before we start, we have a lot to cover. So we start with Maximillian Max Hesse, who is Associate Fellow at the IISS covering Russia and Eurasia. He's also our lead contributors for the Europe and Eurasia section in the report. Max is an expert on Central Asia and Eurasia, and is also the founder of the London-based political risk firm M10 Advisory. We are also joined by John Raine, who is Senior Advisor for Geopolitical Due Diligence here at IISS. John is a foremost Middle East expert. He's also the author of this year Iran chapter, and is also a long-standing friend of the Conflict, Security and Development program. Dr. Benjamin Petrini is a research fellow with the Conflict, Security and Development program at the IISS. He's also managing editor of the report this year. And finally, Rahul Roy-Chaudhury, more or less, yes, sorry, who is Senior Fellow for South and Central Asian Defense, Strategy and Diplomacy. He's a valued friend of the program as well, and also an indispensable contributor to our Asia section every year. Before we begin, let me just make a few housekeeping remarks about today's format and order of play. I'll take the chair prerogative to start by outlining some of the main findings of the report. And I also will highlight some findings for the Americas region, which is my area of expertise. After that, each of the panelists will have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the principal development and the respective regions. And after that, we will open the floor for question. I don't know if you have noticed, but this is actually an hybrid event. So we have, of course, all of you in the room, but we also have people online. So for those joining of us remotely, if you want to already submit your question in the Q&A box you will see on your screen, and we'll try to bring them into the discussion as we go along. And we really hope to have an engaging and active conversation. So please feel free to ask questions once our speaker finish their remarks. With that, I will start just 10 minutes introducing very briefly some of the main findings of the report. Very briefly, for those of you who don't know the report, this is a report which has a global coverage. We cover active conflict in the Americas, Europe and Eurasia, Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and obviously Asia. We have our criteria to cover a conflict which have to do with the frequency of the violent event, the duration of the violent event, and also the organization of the parties. So we are covering instances of armed violence, and as well as proper kind of more classic conflict, interstate conflict. And we can cover also, for instance, in the case of the Latin America, which is obviously armed violence, but without any political ideology behind. So, but we still cover them in the report because the intensity of the violence is such that they qualify as conflict for our purposes. In the report, you will find conflict profiles for each conflict we cover, together with regional analysis, which try to capture the interlinkages between conflict across the regions. We also have a focus this year on non-state armed groups' economic models across the world, which I will discuss a little bit, and I'm sure also all the other panelists will cover. The report is also providing standardized unique data and information on conflict parties, including non-state armed groups. So you'll find really quite unique standardized information globally about those groups, which are, by the way, such an important part of today's conflict landscape. Also, you'll find a lot of data-rich graphics, maps, and key statistics, and the chart of arm of conflict, which is there displayed. We also try to anticipate what is the outlook for conflict and areas of fragility and future hotspot. This is obviously a report which covers a specific period of time, which is June, end of June 2024 to July 2025. So we do try also to make an effort to also try to anticipate what are the future trends in the report, and we'll be discussing them as well with the speaker today. So just very, very briefly, the main takeaway of this year report, what I was alluding earlier on, obviously, is not a very happy picture. The armed conflict levels are at historical heights, both in terms of number and duration. 135 conflicts in 2025, according to USDP PRIO. And also, this is actually one of the highest number in 3 decades. Also, the duration of conflict we have seen extending over time from just over 10 years in the 90s to around 30 years in the last few years. And these obviously reflect an increasingly complex conflict landscape, whereby conflicts are much more intractable amid the proliferation of internal and external conflict parties, different and overlapping agendas, and also exacerbating factors such as geopolitical fragmentation and climate change. The slide you'll see actually refers to the intensity and human cost of conflict worldwide in the period I mentioned. So we see that in this period, the number of fatalities related to violent event has increased by 20% year on year. According to the data we actually use accurate data for this type of calculation. Nearly 240,000 people were killed in violent event in the period of reference, which is July 2024, June 2025. The most violent conflict were, I'm sure I won't surprise you, Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, and Myanmar were the conflict which accounted for most of the fatalities. Also, if we look at other data we have been working with with the report, for instance, what we see is that in the last couple of years there is an increase in civilian deaths over time. According to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, civilian death rose by 40%. They use is kind of an older reporting period is 2022-2024. And this obviously Gaza alone is accounting for 80% of global child casualties, 70% of female casualties. So this is actually something we are also seeing we are highlighting in the report, really how civilians are increasingly targeted willingly or unwillingly in war, and how obviously that's also connected to the crisis of international humanitarian law and the multilateral system in many different ways. Also, forced displacement reached a historical 120 million people by April 2025, led by important displacement crisis. Sudan alone account for 14 million displaced people, followed by Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. Kind of complementing and compounding this rising humanitarian need and humanitarian crisis, what we see is that humanitarian crisis is actually meeting funding collapse, right? What we have seen is that really humanitarian needs are surging. 300 million people requires assistance according to OCHA data. Even the revised target of which actually OCHA reduced its target to 111 million people in need of urgent assistance. Of this reduced target, just 20% of the required fund was met actually by June 2025. So basically, we are really a situation in which we have the humanitarian needs are escalating, but actually we don't have enough resources because clearly you've seen that in that slide I'm showing, it's really on one side is really the NATO defense spending, for instance. Of course, countries are reprioritizing the funding they have to other priorities. So, of course, we have seen during the year the dramatic cuts in foreign aid and overall ODA, led by the US, but also not just the US, also France, Germany, Switzerland, the UK have redirected development budgets towards other priorities. What it means, we'll definitely see, as months progress. But also from a more geopolitical point of view, what we may see, it's really other emerging power kind of stepping in and trying to kind of fill the vacuum. China, you would think, and potentially the Gulf state, which we have already seen with respect to the Middle East, of course. So the other thing I wanted to mention is really the resurgence of interstate conflict, what we've seen in the past, and we see still as a trend is really the fact that the majority of conflicts still remain internal conflict, with most of them, many more with third-party intervention, but also what we've seen in recent time, and especially from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is really this interstate war becoming again quite, or interstate tension becoming again quite central in the at least very visible for obviously for the impact it has. And this is something that comes against the backdrop of rising geopolitical fragmentation, also crisis of the global governance system post Second World War, and really obviously the return of Donald Trump has also increased global uncertainty, intensified this kind of geopolitical fragmentation and competition, and also further weakened multilateral norms. Also, we see rising power emerging with interest-based foreign policies, making diplomatic coordination and the normal way in which the system was working more difficult to work. The UN Security Council we see increasingly paralyzed by great power competition, and also peacekeeping. I'm sure Benjamin will discuss about that. Peacekeeping mission actually also as part of this kind of crisis of the UN system. So just this year, we have seen obviously a continuation of the Ukraine war. We have seen also a very brief India-Pakistan war, which actually was I understand Rahul will discuss about that, but actually was was probably the most intense conventional conflict since the end of 1999, right? I guess. So, and also obviously we have seen Israel and Iran, but also, and here I'm actually, the slide I'm showing is actually Latin America, which, in the past, we haven't seen in Latin America any interstate war in mostly center, right? So this map is also before the build up in the Caribbean, but still there we had decided to actually make the interstate tension as one of the main key trend of this year in the region, and it's quite interesting because we have seen, clearly the region is a region which has a different type of problem when it comes to violence, which is more related to organized crime violence. But what we see now is both, right? We have interstate tension, and obviously we are seeing we heard the very least since when Trump got into power, we heard about military intervention in Mexico, retaking the Panama Canal, and now obviously we're seeing the Venezuela event unfolding. And it's also interesting the connection it has with organized crime, right? Because some of the rationales of those interventions is really combating international organized crime. And indeed, I think with that respect, I think it's important to mention that organized crime has also evolved over time in the region. And what we see is really the transformation of this actor into actors which are actually quasi-political and increasingly quasi-geopolitical, because they do have an economic power which actually drive them to have political agenda, or at least political interest, and in the state where they are, but also abroad. And what we see about those groups is that they are increasingly geoeconomic actor, in the sense that they are now completely globalized. They are involved in many different markets, not just cocaine. Is now much more than cocaine, right? Is environmental crime. It is human trafficking. The map actually I'm showing here, it's comes from we have a spotlight on Latin America, focus on the new sources of revenue for drug trafficking organizations. So what we've seen that human smuggling has become, and trafficking has become one of the main the main source of revenue for those groups, together with environmental crime. Some estimate for environmental crime, including, illegal logging to, trafficking wildlife to illicit gold mining, to narco deforestation, how we call it. So environmental crime accounts for something like 281 billion per year, and of those 281 billion per year, just 1% is actually recovered. So it's quite interesting, I think, to when we look at the geopolitics of Latin America. Of course, there is again this resurgence of interstate conflict, but there is also the criminal geopolitics that comes with this group, which are now literally, also connected with geopolitical powers. We've seen obviously the role of Chinese organized crime groups into the fentanyl trafficking, but also in money laundering of drug trafficking proceed. Obviously, connection not new with Hezbollah between some of the organized crime in Latin America, but also this kind of I would say transnational violence they are unleashing in many cases. We've seen, for instance, the killing of Ecuadorian presidential candidate a couple of years ago, which was done by a organized crime group in Ecuador, which is actually connected to the Mexican cartels. And the same, we saw the killing of Venezuela dissident in Chile last year, which was actually allegedly ordered by Maduro and by the Nicaragua. So it's quite interesting how those groups are now increasingly transnational, also in their political and violence pattern. My last slide, actually I still have two. This one, just to remind ourselves the importance of non-state armed groups across the world. Those data are actually from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And it's very important. It's very interesting data because look at the number of non-state armed groups across the world, the number of people which actually live under their control, and different other factors, such as whether those groups are actually enforcing governance in their territories. So, according to the ICRC, there are something like over 280 groups across the world, and most of them are actually quasi-state groups. They're indeed providing services and extracting taxes. So it's something that is very central to our report and to our work as SDP. It is something that it's actually complicated the conflict landscape, and it's something to actually monitor, because most of those groups are actually groups that increasingly have geopolitical agenda and have an impact which actually is almost of a state, right? In many ways. My last slide. It's just to show you. I mean, it's very small, but that's this year chart of armed conflict. Every year we always visualize some conflict trends as a I would say sister product to the report. This year we have visualized actually migration trends. Obviously, migration is something that is becoming increasingly important for global security. On one side, because clearly we have seen a rising number of migration in the last few years, but also we have seen increasingly issue. We've seen increasingly criminalization of migration in many countries. Obviously, the fact that migration flows are also now, because of restrictive migration policy in the West, in the traditional recipient of migration, you have a lot of those migration flows actually now going towards developing countries or global South, where they normally were in destination countries. So they're becoming destination country. You have countries which are actually less prepared than many to actually welcome those really big flows of displaced people. This creates tension, of course, interstate tension. We've seen Latin America, for instance, looking just at my region between Haiti and Dominican Republic, but also obviously the US and the rest of the region. But also the other thing I wanted to highlight is really the importance of those kind of vulnerable people as a revenue opportunity for non-state armed groups, right? Because obviously there is all an economy, a criminal economy around smuggling and trafficking. This year, we actually created a new indicator which looks at what are the drivers of migration in the conflict-affected countries. So you see in the map, we have displayed them as a traffic light system. And obviously, this is an indicator the team has created based on qualitative data from our network of contributors. But it's an interesting kind of way to look at what are quick way to see what are the main drivers of migration in each country. And with that, since I have spoken more than 10 minutes, I'm sure, I will ask Max, please, to go first.
Setting a timer to keep myself honest about how long I rant on for. Thank you all so much for joining today, and thank you, Irene, for those introductions. As she mentioned, I am one of the contributors to the Europe and Eurasia section, and on Ukraine, which is obviously going to be the focus of my comments for today. Of course, if you have questions about developments elsewhere in the region, particularly in the South Caucasus, where we've had quite notable movements towards peace, hopefully, I'm happy to take those later on. But Ukraine is obviously the focus of our report and the focus of a lot of news these days. So I'll get to that, I promise. But I want to talk first about what we cover in the report, and then some of the trends that we have noticed, as well as some developments in the battlefield that have happened since then that may be relevant to the state of peace talks, or whatever one wants to label them presently. So the key, takeaway from the report over the conflict last year was really remarkably little change in the front lines along the Russian occupation lines in Donetsk Oblast, Luhansk Oblast, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, the two southernmost Ukrainian regions. Russia did make minor advances in a number of those areas, amounting to less than 3/4 of a percentage point of Ukraine's total territory. But we did see in the reporting period that the book covers the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk Oblast on the Russian border with northern Ukraine as well, which lasted roughly from August until the beginning of March, with the occupation of nearly 30,000 square kilometers of Russian territory at that point before it was taken back. The Russian offensive along the dividing lines in eastern Ukraine was really concentrated on a town that has made a lot of news in the last few days, the city of Pokrovsk, just west of the city of Donetsk. This is where Russian forces made the most advantages over that reporting period, moving from long-standing lines of control to the west of the city of Donetsk to Pokrovsk's outskirts, and then roughly from late September until now, launching a siege of that city, which is currently, by all indications, although there is significant fog of war, almost entirely under the occupation of Russian forces. Ukraine, as I mentioned, did have its advances over Kursk in a surprise attack across the border there, aimed at pressuring the Russian Federation before Russian forces were able to take that back, as I mentioned at the beginning of March. And that's where we really see one of the key developments covered in the reporting period that has also been crucial to understanding the fighting since, as well as going forward, which is the adoption of drone technology. Of course, drones have been a key story throughout this conflict, both in terms of their use as long-term strike instruments, but also on the battlefield. And there we have to say objectively that Russia proved to be more adept at employing new techniques in the use of drone fighting on the ground there, specifically through the use of fiber optic drones, ones that are flown through a cable, rather than flown wirelessly, as had long been the standard, because jamming technology had really gotten to the point where neither side was able to make significant advances during them. Russia has set up entire schools of drone warfare within its military command, and it has actually used those units that led the fight in Kursk to retake that territory, now in Pokrovsk and elsewhere along them. So in terms of Ukraine's own ability to fight on the battlefield, as well as Western developments in lessons from this technology, that latest development will be a supremely important one for the fighting in the coming weeks. Now, last year, the changes in drone technology, Ukraine had the advantage using naval drones, also known as USVs, unmanned surface vehicles, that had enabled them to carry out a lot of attacks on the Russian Black Sea Fleet, pin that back into the east of the Black Sea along Russia's de jure territory rather than an occupied Crimea. That remains the the case, that it hasn't been that Ukraine has in some ways lost the advantage there, but just that the pace of these drone developments has been so rapid that it is the one thing that enables really large changes on the battlefield. What exactly the next of those developments will be could very well determine the next one there as well. And so, as I mentioned, I would allude briefly to developments since we've not only had the potential fall of Pokrovsk in the weeks since the report was published, but we've also, in just the last few weeks alone, had a new Russian advance in the north of Donetsk Oblast, focused on a series of towns on the tripartite border between Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv, aiming to retake strategic heights there, including one symbolically important but also strategically important monastery. This is really as part of Russia's aim to put pressure both from the south, from the lines towards Pokrovsk, as well as from this area around Sviatohirsk, the name of the monastery, towards the two key Ukrainian-held towns of Kramatorsk and Slovyansk that form the core of Ukraine's defenses there and leading into Kharkiv Oblast, Poltava, and other parts of central eastern Ukraine as well. This is something that is being debated in the peace talks at the moment, the extent of Ukraine's withdrawal there, but just remember for the purposes of this discussion that there is a new offensive that is ongoing there where the Russians have shown some of the same initiative they've shown around Pokrovsk in recent weeks, and that territory is crucial to protecting Ukraine's access from the Dnieper River into Kharkiv Oblast in the east, and from there on is where Ukraine's famous flatlands begin. So if Ukraine were to lose those cities either in battlefield or in peace negotiations, it would really open up the front to a future armored attack, even if that's something that we haven't seen in either the reporting period or since then. The next point that I really want to talk on is also we've had some additional very important developments in the use of long-range strikes, but by both sides. Russia has primarily focused on adapting its missile technology to be able to better invade Patriot missiles, IRIS-T interceptors, and other air defense technologies that Ukraine has, as well as, of course, engaging in large-scale drone swarms. At the beginning of the reporting period, around July of last year, Russian swarms of over 100 projectiles per night were exceedingly rare. Today, the average number of projectiles, missiles, and drones, almost 90% drones that Russia launches into Ukrainian airspace on a daily basis is over 140. So what was once rare is today, tragically, the commonplace occurrence. This speaks to the importance of keeping Ukrainian air defenses ongoing, but also the importance of adapting technology there on the Ukrainian side as well. Kyiv has been able to use its own drone technology rather than missile technology primarily. Of course, some of that is a political issue in terms of what long-range weapons Kyiv is allowed and not allowed to use in responding to Russian strikes and in targeting Russia's warfare, but has really used its own drones to target refineries and oil and gas infrastructure across Russia at a level that in recent months, primarily since the end of the reporting period in June and July, has increased significantly. This has caused widespread shortages of fuel in some limited Russian regions. Is it enough to materially impact the Russian budget? No, it is not. That is something that sanctions are primarily responsible for. Of course, Russian fuel that is sold domestically is sold at domestic and subsidized prices rather than the international price, even with the discount that the G7 Plus's oil price cap has resulted in, means that fundamentally it is always better from the Kremlin budgetary perspective to be focused on selling oil abroad. And of course, sometimes when there's decreased refining capacity domestically, that enables more Russian oil to get onto the international market. Kyiv has been very cautious in some of these attacks. We have seen significant damage to Russian refining infrastructure in the southwest of Ukraine, but for example, we have not seen extensive damage to Russian oil pipeline export infrastructure in that region. This is important for bearing in mind in terms of the wider region, because an often overlooked fact is that Kazakhstan is still dependent on Russia for over 80% of its oil exports, the vast majority of which, more than 90% of which, go via Russia's Black Sea oil export terminal. terminals. So additional Ukrainian damage to Russian export pipelines in that area would risk not only damaging Russia's war economy, of course, but also have a significant impact on Kazakhstan. But that is a potential development to watch for in the future. In terms of other sections of the report, I just want to give a quick shout out to Patty Jin for his contribution on the section on the leakage of weapons from Ukraine across Europe. This is, of course, something that hasn't been necessarily top of mind in terms of the conflict or in terms of the risks that emerge from it. And I'll get to some of those in a minute, but it is something worth keeping in mind and worth really studying. And I'm very glad that IISS is supporting research into those networks and challenges, because regardless of whether the conflict continues or there is some kind of a settlement, whether it be temporary or not, that is exactly the kind of issue that has been overlooked in past conflicts and past supplies of foreign weaponry to war zones that has often proliferated conflict elsewhere. But that turns me to the final sort of state of developments we've seen in relation to the conflict, which has been the spread of so-called hybrid conflict and hybrid warfare outside of the immediate battlefield region itself, whether that be through tactics such as the dragging of anchors behind boats to damage cable and piping infrastructure in the North and Baltic Sea, or what we've seen primarily since the reporting period, but the use of drone swarms to disrupt aviation at both military and commercial airports across Europe. Those of you based here in London may remember the Gatwick drone incident of a few years ago. Still never formally attributed, by the way, but something that we now see suspected of the Kremlin being directly involved in, and where we have seen governments in Europe put forward direct accusations of Russian involvement in some of that activity, particularly in Poland. This is obviously a question that we face here in the United Kingdom, in particular as well, with our reliance on subsea infrastructure. You may have seen there have been a number of reports in recent days about the activities of Russian spy ships off of British waters themselves, and really thinking about both the European, the UK, and the NATO response to such incidents, and at what point they are considered hostile actions by a foreign government is something that I think is top of mind of policymakers over in Whitehall, and should be for our audiences therefore, as well. And finally, I just want to finish with a brief note on the state of the talks that are ongoing now, which obviously have gathered so much media attention, because we do cover at least the first rounds of talks that happened after the change in administration in Washington. In the report. And I think the shortest that I would say is we are still very much at the stage of negotiations about negotiations 9 months on, right? These are primarily over the last few days been negotiations in Geneva between Kyiv and the United States, as well as the wider coalition of the willing, those countries that are supporting Ukraine, rather than direct negotiations with Russia. Now, to make what you will of the current administration's negotiating strategy, or their differences in priorities around the conflict in Ukraine versus previous administrations or other members of the coalition of the willing. And what I would say is that even if one accepts that there are differences there, one should also understand that there are big gulfs between what the Trump administration's potential desires may be, whether it's on economic issues, the economic future of Ukraine and its resources, or crucially, the future of natural gas resources, than they are between Vladimir Putin's position. So we currently are still in a state of negotiating around having a joint Western position that will then be put to the Russians. We have not seen any indication, I believe, from Russia that it has any interest in decreasing military pressure throughout these negotiations. So regardless of whether one believes that they have a chance of succeeding or not, I think the best strategy is certainly to prepare and to understand the conflict dynamics as if they may be continuing, whether that be on the battlefield or in terms of that hybrid warfare, because tragically, I expect that this is not the last time that we'll be discussing and presenting these issues. Thank you so much, and thank you, Irene, and I'll pass over
Thanks,
now.
Max. That was great, and I'm glad you covered the peace talks, because I'm sure that's going to be one of the questions. So I'm sure that we'll go back to that. But John, please, Middle East, just to pass from one complicated region to another.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. Thank you, Max. Complicated and violent, but in a very different way. Probably the most valuable insert into the chapter here is a timeline for events in the Middle East over the reporting period, because there have been a lot of events, and there have been a lot of events since the closure of the reporting period. The two critical framing events during the reporting period were undoubtedly the fall of Assad's regime in Syria, its replacement by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who's then known, who's now the president, of course, of Syria. And the second event, I would argue, is the one right at the end of the reporting period, which was the 12-day war, as it's being known, between Iran and Israel. And I'd like to draw out just a few points as to why I think they were important, and draw on a few themes, too, that are clear from the Middle East chapter, and which I think give some indication as to where likely sources of conflict lie in the future. So the first of those is that the theatre is still dominated by non-state armed groups. Irene introduced the theme quite rightly earlier on: 35 million people in the Middle East. If you include Turkey in their rough calculation on the region's population, that's something like 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people in the Middle East. Their lives are governed on a daily basis by non-state armed groups. Just to anatomize that slightly, the important thing is, first of all, they're non-state, though these are all acting outside of state control. And secondly, they are armed. And that gives an indication of the proliferation of weapons and ordnance in the Middle East as a result of these conflicts. All of those constitute ongoing and ideal conditions for non-state armed groups to both maintain a presence, relatively low rent through relatively unsophisticated revenue-generating methods, and to continue to take advantage of unresolved disputes. So non-state armed groups both dominate the conflict terrain in the Middle East, and the conditions for non-state armed groups are still there. There are a set of necessary conditions. One is access to weaponry. The second is basic finance. Third is the unresolved grievance. There's also a sufficient condition, which is the presence of an external patron. And the external patron has been Iran, and I'll say a few words about Iran in a moment, but Iran is certainly still there. So all up, the conditions for non-state armed groups to continue in the Middle East, despite the onslaught, and that is probably the fairest way to describe the attacks that have been mounted by Israel in 6 different theatres. Non-state armed groups are still a dominant feature of the Middle East. So the ways in which that has impacted externally have been many, some near in, just disruption of global supply lines, particularly through Houthis in the Red Sea, but also through driving migration, displacement, through spawning of criminality. And thirdly, a rather neglected subject these days, but one which is directly linked to non-state armed groups, which is terrorism and the export of terrorism from the region. The number of affiliates of AQ and ISIS, both in the region and across the world, is still significant. The estimates for the number of people whose lives are controlled on a daily basis by AQ or ISIS affiliated groups is still very high. It's something like 20% of the overall number, so around about 30 million, are still in one way or another connected to groups which we know export in a very systematic way terrorism beyond the region. So that's the picture on non-state armed groups, vividly brought out, I think, by the graphics and the data in the report. Second thing, where does that leave the states? So we heard from Max of the ongoing defining state-on-state conflict. The states in the region who are now belligerent, 2 of those, Iran and Israel, crossed a very significant boundary when they launched sustained, directed, and casualty-inflicting attacks on one another. That reset the parameters for conflict in the region. Israel, by far the strongest and militarily and also nuclear power in the region, was drawn into a scale of conflict which last year was probably unimaginable, and it did so with the active kinetic support of the US, which again was something that we had not expected, certainly under the previous administration. Those two states are fighting over issues that are related to non-state armed groups or non-state groups. So the drivers for conflict remain the actions of non-state groups. Will Iran continue to sponsor those groups? It's fighting a credibility deficit in that it has not been as successful a patron of either regimes, most notably the Assad regime, or armed groups, most notably Hezbollah, which its clients had hoped it would be. So it has that strike against it. At the same time, it is woven into Iranian defense strategy that they will fight asymmetrically and through others. It's very difficult to imagine them not at some point trying to reconstitute connections to either existing groups or to do what they've done very successfully over 4 decades, which is to exploit gaps politically, ethnically, and cracks within states where they can get in. They're very adept at doing that, and we should expect them to return to that. The other state, Israel is still exploring the outer edges of its strategic envelope, to put it politely. There's no indication that the Iranians reached the end of their original strategic design, which was most notably to suppress and eliminate Hamas, to do the same to Hezbollah if they could, and if not, then to significantly damage their military capabilities. They have retained the ability to strike against targets extraterritorially across the region. And if you look at the graphic on Iranian strikes in Lebanon, for example, that's a helpful indication of how determined the IDF remains to strike against its opponents overseas. That is also inevitably going to be a driver of conflict and a mobilizing agent for non-state armed groups. Let me say a quick word about Syria. I've spoken about states and non-state armed groups. Syria is now a state that grew out of a non-state armed group. So that's not the first time this has happened in the Middle East, but it's the first time in recent memory. And we hold our breath to see what happens in Syria. The significant elements in the transition are, one, implementing nationwide governance, which is not rooted in the interests of the ruling clique. And secondly, economic regeneration. And as Irene has mentioned, the economy of non-state armed groups is a fascinating subject, and it's going to be critical. You have to modulate, in the case of Syria, from a form of municipal and irregular economic conduct geared towards survival to running a national economy integrated into the global financial system. None of that has yet happened. It's a long journey for the Syrians to make. They've garnered a terrific amount of support already, most notably from President Trump. But why it's an interesting example is that this is possibly going to show the way for non-state armed groups to transition into national roles and to conform with international standards. I haven't mentioned anything so far about Sudan. I'd just like to say a quick word about Sudan. The tragedy of Sudan has been underreported. That's, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that its impact on geopolitics and geoeconomics has been limited. Secondly, other stories elsewhere in the region have dominated. But Sudan remains not only a tragedy per se, well covered, by the way, in the chapters here, both in Sudan and there's a South Sudan chapter as well. But Sudan has also been an internationalized conflict. It has drawn in other actors in the Middle East who are consequential. So I'd encourage you to read the Sudan chapters too. My final reflection is that the big things that have happened since the report are largely good things, not entirely, but largely. And we are, of course, waiting to see whether President Trump's attempt to bring about, if not peace, then a ceasefire plus or a pathway to peace are successful. The obstacles which remain in Gaza alone are formidable, but it has introduced a new element into the geopolitics of the region. One thing I think that it has done is has cemented the, for now, marginalization of the Iranians and the, for now, the ascendancy of the Iranians as a state over their non-state armed opponents. But much remains to be, much depends, of course, on personal engagement of the president and on the reactions of states and non-states. So far, The reaction of the states, this key state, has been cautious. Israel, the reaction of Iran has been kind of non-committal but not really supportive, and the reaction of non-state armed groups has not been positive. So gaps remain to be closed between the two key groups of actors in the region, the states and the non-states. But it is the non-states who, by all indications, are not going anywhere.
Thanks, John. That was great. Also, really the explanation on non-state armed groups and how they operate in the region, which I think is probably one of the laboratory of non-state armed groups. And as you say, Syria is actually an interesting case studies. And we do have the slide you see is actually from the chapter we have looking at the economic model of HTC over time. Africa. Benjamin, please.
Thank you very much, Irene. Thank you to the other panelists and everyone. Sub-Saharan Africa, like other regions, has seen its security trends worsen in the last 12 months. It is extremely concerning as there is like a confluence of factors of conflicts becoming more violent and more entrenched, states in turn weakening both at national and local level, and also there is like a shift, a very important shift of external involvement with less humanitarian aid and development assistance, and the erosion of traditional conflict management tools. So these are some of the points that I will try to tackle here. So most of the conflicts in these books are what we call intrastate conflicts, civil wars, either with or without external intervention. The Uppsala Conflict Data Program counts 61 conflicts globally that took place in 2024. 57 of them are these are civil wars. Interstate conflicts are very important, but the majority of the conflicts globally are civil wars or situation of internal conflict. Sub-Saharan Africa has 50% of all these civil wars. There were 28 internal conflicts in 2024. Fatalities increased by 8% over the last reporting period. And although no new conflicts broke out in 2024, there has been a consolidation and expansion of many of these armed conflicts, and I will get into that in a minute. Non-state armed groups is a key prominent feature of these conflicts that drive the fragmentation of security and the erosion of sovereignty in many sub-Saharan African countries. 37 out of the 74 non-state conflicts globally are in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you can see the graph on the top left corner, the gray line is the non-state conflicts, basically the armed conflicts that are fought only between non-state armed groups without the direct participation of the state. So you can see that from 2010 and 2015 on, there has been like a skyrocketing trend. As well, you can see the skyrocketing trends in the number of civil wars with external intervention, and this has been an ongoing trend of the last decade. Now, in parallel with conflicts, obviously the humanitarian crises are those that tend to get worse. In terms of forced displacement, numbers of refugees and IDPs, globally, 1 in 2 IDPs is located on the continent, and 1 in 4 refugees is located in Africa. So between the two, there are over 50 million forcibly displaced people. And that leads me to the point about the recent slash in funding for humanitarian crisis. This has been led by the closure of USAID, but has been followed also by other European donors. Now, this has an obvious direct effect and impact on more lives lost and on health indicators, and it is increasing food insecurity. So there are all sort of ripple effects on the development gains that have been gained in the last decade or so. So there is obviously a moral argument, but there is also a very precise political and strategic argument for why humanitarian and development assistance are important. They are traditional tools of soft power. They enable countries to be engaged. So when you slash and when you cut that tool of engagement and that avenue with recipient countries, you are actually diminishing your leverage and your influence into that country. And the second point about the cutting of humanitarian aid is that when that takes place in countries that are affected by conflict, and as you can see from the map, most of the ones in Africa from sort of west to east are in one way or another affected by conflict. When that happens in these countries, sovereignty is eroded. You're actually undermining the governments, and you're giving more power to non-state armed groups. You're giving more leverage to non-state armed groups to increase their legitimacy in terms of being sort of a valid and legitimate governance alternative. So there is both sort of the moral argument, but also the strategic one. The mounting evidence in some of the countries in the Sahel, in Somalia and Mozambique, we have seen that in the areas where aid has been cut, Islamist groups, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, have gained more ground, both territorially and in governance. Now, just to give you a quick snapshot of where conflicts are located in this region, and we usually divide this region into sort of macro sub-regions. And so I'll give you just a quick snapshot about the Sahel, including the countries of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. These countries now account for 50% of all terrorism-related fatalities globally. There has been in the last year a significant qualitative shift in these conflicts and in the strategy that these Islamist actors are putting. One is an increased pressure on provincial capitals, on both provincial capitals in Burkina Faso and in Mali, and specifically in the national capital of Bamako in Mali. And these Islamist actors are doing that by cutting and by disrupting the trade corridors between Mali and Senegal, as well as between Burkina Faso and Togo. So their strategy is sort of trying to starve the government of the needed resources to address these conflicts. Now, something similar was seen with all the differences in terms of, if we want to speak of the strategies adopted by non-state armed groups, by how M23 encircled and put a blockade on the provincial capital of Goma last year and eventually conquered that capital and that region. So the countries Burkina Faso, Mali, and to an extent Niger are very much at risk of collapse, according to a lot of observers. The Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa, yeah, as John has mentioned, Sudan is definitely the conflict that leads a lot of the trends in fatalities, in violent events, and in displacement. In 2025, the Sudan Armed Forces have conquered Khartoum, and the paramilitary rapid support forces have conquered El Fasher in Darfur. So de facto, the division of the country, the partition of the country is already in place without any ceasefire in place. Somalia. The cutting in aid has impacted Somalia greatly. The gains that were made against Al-Shabaab in 2023 have evaporated, as Al-Shabaab now controls 30% of the country. And more than that, it is being able to exploit the polarization and the political rivalries between the federal government and the national governments of Somaliland, of Puntland as well. So there is also a great risk of collapse for Somalia as well. Moving quickly to the DRC and Rwanda, this has been like a sort of a remarkable year for that region. As I mentioned, M23 has captured the regions of North and South Kivu. And this has also sort of fragmented these border areas between the DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. There is a peace process in place with the most recent iteration of the signing of a peace framework between the leading rebel group, the M23, which is supported by Rwanda, and the DRC. But this sort of has not brought actual and substantive gains, as there are many areas still to be looked at. Last, I just want to have a couple of points about how conflicts are addressed and the policy side. One trend has been in the last few years. Now, these are ongoing trends, but they've been exacerbated in the last year. One is about the decrease in security force assistance, and this has run in parallel with the decrease in humanitarian aid. The shifts by the US and France as sort of actors involved in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, the decrease in peacekeeping operations, and we can see, obviously, none of these is a cause and effect, but the pullout of the peacekeeping operation in the DRC a year later, then Goma fell to the M23. In the Sahel, the pullout of France and the inclusion of Russia's paramilitaries has also led to worsening conflict trends there. And Somalia, as well, as I just mentioned, Al-Shabaab has recovered all the lost territory after the 2023 offensive because that security assistance has not been continued. Now, there have been also my second point about the new approaches to conflict resolution. Less and less we see comprehensive peace processes being brought to the table, and more there are these sort of local agreements based on security arrangements or on single issues. But these have the effect, in a way, to continue that fragmentation of security, to crystallize conflict and basically impede then a further effort at a comprehensive peace. And a recent trend which has been sort of brought in by the Trump administration is this emphasis on transactionalism. And the agreement between the DRC and Rwanda, while remarkable, leaves out important details in terms of implementation, in terms of verification mechanism, in terms of monitoring, and are also very much based on aspirational commitments. So one should look also at the issue of peace and mediation as sort of like an important craft that cannot be very much improvised. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Benjamin. It was to cover all this big region, and thanks for also your remarks on the peace agreement as they are now, and obviously the challenges. And finally, Asia. Rahul, has been quite an interesting year as well for the region.
Thank you. Yes, it has been. Sorry, I'm going to speak about two interstate conflicts that have taken place this year in South Asia, and whose consequences will continue into the next year, and I think definitely into the 11th edition of the Armed Conflict Survey in 2026. And those conflicts are, firstly, the 87-hour India-Pakistan military conflict 6 months ago during 7th to the 10th of May 2025. And secondly, the surge in the Pakistan-Afghanistan border conflict last month. The trigger for the India-Pakistan conflict was a brutal terror attack on the 22nd of April, targeting Hindu male tourists in India's Kashmir Valley, in which 26 civilians were killed. India blamed Pakistan-based militants for the attack, and 2 weeks later, on the night of 6th of May, mounted an airborne counter-terror operation against 9 terror camps and bases in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir and mainland Pakistan, calling the operation Operation Sindoor. This led to a Pakistani counter-response called Operation Bunyan Mahsoos, targeting Indian military sites by drones and missiles, alongside intense shelling across the line of control, the de facto border in Kashmir. This led to an India counter response, and then finally the accession of hostilities on the 10th of May. This marked, as Irene had said, this marked the greatest conflict between India and Pakistan in decades, with the risk of escalation into a full-fledged war between the two nuclear weapon powers, India and Pakistan. The two big key takeaways for me from the conflict were, firstly, the strong, divergent, and contested narratives of the conflict from both sides amidst an unprecedented sea of misinformation and disinformation by both media and government. This included the nature and extent of respective military and drone strikes, combat aircraft losses on both sides, impact of strikes, and even the role or not of the United States in intervening or facilitating the cessation of hostilities on the 10th of May. Indeed, at times, if you look at the narratives, it appeared that two countries were fighting different conflicts. But 6 months later, as a result, any authoritative analysis of the military aspects of this conflict is still shrouded in a veil of secrecy and deception. The second takeaway for me, and more importantly, arguably in terms of implications, is that both countries believed and claimed, not surprisingly, they each had won the conflict. This should have, as in previous India-Pakistan conflicts and crises, led to a reduction of bilateral tensions. But the opposite happened. There has been a ratcheting up of bilateral tensions and rhetoric amidst a hardening of positions towards each other. India, for example, maintains that Operation Sindoor has paused, not ended, and can be resumed without accepting nuclear blackmail, as it calls it, by Pakistan. New Delhi announced a new normal, revised counterterrorism doctrine that considers the next Pakistan-based terror attack on India an act of war against India. Significantly, New Delhi has not differentiated between what India considers to be Pakistani government sponsorship of the next terror attack or the actual perpetrators of such an attack, including the Pakistan-based terror outfits Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. In response, Pakistan announced a new normal of response doctrine, describing India's abeyance of the decades-long Indus Waters Treaty as an act of war against Pakistan, to which Pakistan, would respond with full force across the complete spectrum of national power. Adding that in a future conflict, Pakistan would not hold back and its response might lead to cataclysmic devastation. Alongside, the elevation of Pakistan's army chief as a field marshal, shortly to become its most powerful chief of defense staff, was a direct result of the conflict with India. In effect, the next India-Pakistan crisis is likely to take place sooner rather than later, amidst India denying the risk of escalation of conflict and Pakistan denying the impact of anti-India terror outfits on its territory in triggering such a conflict. And all this takes place in the absence of any back channel or crisis management mechanism between the two countries, amidst the lack of a structured India-Pakistan peace dialogue for the past 13 years. The recent terror attack in New Delhi on the 10th of November that killed 15 people has not triggered a reaction as India continues to investigate the regions of the attack. Now, briefly moving on to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border conflict last month. On the 9th of October, less than 2 months ago, a surge in the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict took place with Pakistan's intelligence-led air and drone strikes in Kabul on high-level targets of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, and the Baluch Liberation Army, the BLA, both groups that carry out terror attacks in Pakistan. Pakistan also launched strikes in Afghanistan's Paktika province. This led to a robust, unconventional Taliban response against Pakistani border posts. These cross-border clashes, including artillery exchanges and drone strikes, marked the most intense fighting between the two countries in decades, resulting in dozens of casualties on both sides before a temporary ceasefire was brokered on the 19th of October through Qatari and Turkish mediation. Coincidentally, the Pakistani strikes against Afghanistan in October started on the day Taliban Acting Foreign Minister Muttaqi made his first visit to India. Earlier, also in December 2024, Pakistani airstrikes had killed dozens in Afghanistan's Paktika province, targeting suspected TTP militants, with the Taliban carrying out retaliatory strikes against Pakistan. Relations with Pakistan, arguably Afghanistan's most important neighbor in terms of trade, people-to-people ties, and security, continues to remain strained, largely due to ongoing tensions over the TTP and recurring border disputes. This is actually in marked contrast to a popular view within Pakistan in August 2021 that a Taliban regime in Afghanistan would be best for it, in view of the support and safe haven the Afghan Taliban had found in Pakistan over a decade while fighting against the Afghan government, as well as its traditional anti-India focus. At that time, India considered the Taliban as international terrorists who, along with the Haqqani network, were considered to be proxies of Pakistan's main intelligence agency to carry out terror attacks against Indian nationals and assets in Afghanistan. In marked contrast, at this time, actually on the 16th of October, Pakistan's Defense Minister Khwaja Asif accused Kabul of fighting India's proxy war amidst ongoing cross-border clashes, a remark that further exposed Islamabad's frustration and the deepening rift between Pakistan and the Taliban regime. The Taliban swiftly refuted these remarks, but these tensions will continue. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rahul. We have, 22 minutes for questions. So we have quite a lot of questions online already, but maybe we'll start from the room. There are mic as well, if you can be as brief as possible so we can get here in front and then the gentleman there. please.
Thank you. That's an absolutely fascinating, if necessarily quite high-level review of everything that's going on in the world at the moment. I'm really taken by the commentary around non-state and quasi-state actors. And of course, you mentioned the Wagner Group now, the Africa Corps, and their role in several theatres in this area. I wonder if you could perhaps comment on how effectively you see the Africa Corps, the Wagner Group, furthering Russia's broader international agenda, and what implications that might have for peace and stability in the Sahel and elsewhere.
That's a great question. Should we take the other one as well? So, yeah, Marcus.
Hello, my name is Marcus Geisser, International Committee of the Red Cross. Two questions. One for the gentleman on Europe. There's a lot of talk about war readiness amongst NATO alliance members. For example, in our world of the ICRC, we have now active conversations with the NATO on IHL compliance for potential large-scale combat operations, etc. Do you see something? What can you tell us about that? Yes, countries getting ready for that. And then my second question to the gentleman who focused on Asia. Why did you not mention the nonetheless international armed conflict between Thailand, I understand Cambodia, yes, which at least from an ICC perspective, very recently was quite an event. It was only for a few days, but nonetheless, there were clashes between those two countries. The ICC got involved in POW exchanges and things like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. I think there was another question. Please.
Thank you very much. Comfort Era International Crisis Group. I just wanted to zoom into developments taking place today. Irene, for you, specifically on Venezuela, one can't get into his head, but I'd be curious to get from you what could look like a victory lap for President Trump today, short of regime change in Venezuela. And then to Benjamin, I'd be curious if you can just clarify whether you are associating the expansion and consolidation of various groups tied to the decline of international aid, or maybe specifically in the case of Somalia, the fact that there are multiple divisions between the federal Somali state and the federal member states as well. And I think the same true for the Sahelian countries as well. And then one question for Dr. Raine, what do you make, or maybe even Roy-Chaudhury as well, what do you make of the relationship that's growing between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia? I mean, you focused a lot on non-armed groups, but the other undercurrent is sort of rising nuclear arsenals and might is right narrative that is also informing a number of these conflicts that we're seeing as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Comfort. They're really good questions. So maybe we start, shall we just go and start with Max on your question?
I hope you can hear me. On preparation for war in Europe and Europe's readiness in terms of responding, the reality is we first face another serious question, which is Europe responding together with the United States or alone from the United States? And in part because this question is so large, it has really resulted in a big delay to the kind of decision-making, cost provisioning and budgeting that is so necessary to ensure that a response can be done, whether that is independently or not. I think therefore that the conversation needs to be focused on trying to ensure that the United States remains on side, but preparing for the worst case scenario while recognizing that overtly public preparations for that worst case scenario in which U.S. support is lost may themselves have an impact on the potential for additional support. And then I would also say, without getting into too large a debate about mutually assured destruction and the importance of nuclear weaponry and the nuclear umbrella that Europe has and how it positions that umbrella, including without the United States going forward, is that we don't need to just prepare and ensure the preparations are done for conventional warfare and the idea of a Russian invasion coming down the Suwalki Gap, the infamous Russian attack via Belarus and Kaliningrad into Poland that has been war gamed probably to a significant extent, and increasingly in recent years, but also look to working out what I was alluding to earlier, which is some of those so-called hybrid warfare, or at least questionably attributional warfare issues, and ensuring that we're properly responded to those. Because while it's always best to prepare for the worst case scenario of large-scale European war, and particularly in the situation in which Russia has proven to be a unmitigatable aggressor in Europe, that behooves every country to do. But that regardless of what kind of settlement comes out or developments we see on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that hybrid warfare is and non-attributional incidents or questionably attributional incidents are going to continue to proliferate. So we have to both deal with the potential threat that there may be in the future, but also deal with the threats that are being that we currently face on a day-to-day basis, which we do not have adequate measures to respond to.
Thanks, Max. And John, as you address your question, maybe there's also a question from online from Frediano Finucci about who achieved a greater result in the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and also was the Iranian nuclear program really stopped? Is it true that Israel was running short of missiles? If you can address all of those issues.
Yes, I will do. I'll go more broadly and scoop up the nuclear question too on in the context of the Saudi-Pac agreement. So first of all, starting with this, so who won the 12-day war? Well, if you just look at material damage sustained on the two sides, then it was the Israelis who won it because they sustained less damage. If you take a broader view, who had the moral victory there? Almost undoubtedly, the Iranians will claim they do, that they had the moral victory, and they'll try to leverage the moral victory by re-establishing themselves as the leading resistance state to Israel. And a lot of the rhetoric that's been coming out of Tehran since then has focused upon resistance, the right and the obligation to resist. They still very much see themselves as leading an arc, an axis of resistance, so they can take that away from it. But I think, to be honest, the material damage is offsets any moral advantage that the Iranians may try to derive from this. So it did critical damage to their air defenses, their missile rerocketry, and to their nuclear program. Did it stop the nuclear program? It certainly, for now, stopped. So the amount of rebuilding, making safe, re-equipping that will be required is significant. And even the more conservative assessments showed that the program had been arrested in certain key areas around, I think, metallization, and which in turn slows down weaponization. Added to which the structural damage that was done to the installations in Natanz was significant. So I think the answer is, if you look at where they were heading, that trajectory has been definitely interrupted. Will they resume attempts? And this gets onto the wider question about the nuclearization of the Middle East. The Iranians have been very clear about their right to nuclear research and a civilian nuclear program. They have always been ambiguous, going right back to Ayatollah Khamenei's famous fatwas on the rights and the wrongs of having a nuclear program over whether or not they will militarize, but they've enjoyed a lot of strategic ambiguity by not being clear on that point. I think what they will do is try to restore themselves to the position they were in before, which is a threshold nuclear state, where they sufficiently competent, both in terms of technical achievement, the intellectual property required to do this, and the uranium, to a civilian state that could be converted into, that could produce a weapon system. I think that's probably their intent. The important proviso on this is they do not want, I believe, to trigger another Israeli strike. And the Israelis have made clear that they will strike if they think Iran is, I think they've used the phrase restarting, but certainly if it gets above a critical level. So we may see a cooling off of Iranian activity around that pro-tem. Pakistan, I'll let Rahul take the Pakistan end of this. Saudi's had a long-standing defense relationship with the Pakistanis, and part of that has similarly been a useful ambiguity over whether or not they therefore have a lien on the, as it's sometimes referred to, the Islamic bomb. The important considerations here, does this fit Saudi's strategic purposes? Not now. It's nearly all risk and no benefit. Secondly, would they want to design something internally themselves? I think the tipper for that would be in turn the Iranian program. But one thing I would say is that the development of the skills base in Saudi Arabia in order to be able to move to that is ongoing. And each time they revisit this possibility, it is more of a possibility that they could have an active nuclear program. But I think the strategic decision to do that has by no means been taken.
Thanks, John. I'll do maybe the Latin American one at the end. Benjamin,
yes.
your Africa.
To what extent the Africa cores are advancing Russia's interest? I think it's a moving target. But if we take Russia's strategy from the very beginning, which was to erode EU's and France's legitimacy there, that was successful. They managed to have all those security assistance forces by France and the US kicked out of the country, including the terminating the peacekeeping operation. Russia has been also deepening its security relationship, diplomatic relationship with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger since they turned their democratic government into military ones. So at the moment, it is hard to say because these countries are in such a difficult situation to counteract the advance of the Islamist insurgencies. The Africa Corps is obviously both by its capacity and its mandate and resources unable to offer any meaningful answer there. So I think that the overarching goal of Russia of ousting European influence in the region is still the primary one, and so they still have the upper end. The second question about is the expansion of non-state armed groups directly related to the decrease in aid? No, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't have the sort of the presumption to say that it is a combination of many different factors. If we assume that aid, if we know that humanitarian and development aid supports government by delivering services, and in that process, when aid is cut, especially if it had become such a structural factor for many years, then that no doubt has a negative impact on government's capacity and legitimacy, on services and on security. And so we can say that non-state armed groups in this context, in the Sahel, in Somalia, they benefit by governments becoming less legitimate and having less capacity to address the development needs of the governments and development needs of their populations.
Thanks, Benjamin. Rahul?
So, in terms of the first question, I focused on South Asia because I'm a specialist on the region. I'm not an expert on Southeast Asia, but I think it's covered very well in the book, The Conflict in Southeast Asia. In terms of the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement of the 17th of September between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, there are two or three things. Firstly, this is an agreement that has been long under negotiation. So it's been negotiated for at least for the last 2 years that one is aware, which also means that it's not a direct result of the conflicts that took place before the agreement, the India-Pakistan conflict, for example, or the Iran-Israel conflict. So I think the first point is to put it in context, the sort of the origins of this agreement. The second is that in terms of conventional aspects, as John said, I mean, the Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have a long, strong defense partnership relationship. This one believes will be strengthened, and we may see. In fact, already today, a former Pakistani army chief is in charge of the international forces that Saudi Arabia has put together. We may also see, I think, growing cooperation on the defense front between the two countries, and possibly more Saudi funding to Pakistan in this respect. On the nuclear space, I think that Pakistan is going to be quite cautious about sharing technology in that sense, which is the concern that countries have over the pact with Saudi Arabia. I mean, Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state, but it also knows that it can leverage the diplomatic and political aspects of this capacity rather than actually delivering on it. So I think, my own sense is that we're not going to see, a direct sort of trade-off on the nuclear front, but definitely on the conventional front, yes.
Thanks, Rahul. And on the Latin American piece, there are actually a number of questions on Venezuela. I think yours was the most, but there are also a question on Venezuela and also Mexico, which are around basically the war on drugs, right? So I think on Venezuela, to start with, clearly what we see with Trump is not really a fundamental change in the war on drug kind of strategy that the US has spearheaded in the region. Of course, it's an aggravation of that. I think in terms of what victory would look like for Trump, as you said, it's always very difficult to understand what the logic is. But clearly, I think for me personally, the main driver against there is not. Could be a regime change, but just if the regime change is actually leading to a better deal in terms of energy and natural resources. I think that's probably the strategic motivation, one of the strategic motivation for Trump. And also there is obviously the internal also and domestic part of it, because clearly, yesterday actually this kind of phantomatic and quite mysterious cartels of the Sands have been designated as FTO, which again, it's if we see the way in which the designation has been used by the US until now, it's really more about having an internal discourse of migrants which are related to these cartels and could be then deported without due process, and also this kind of strikes in the Caribbean, which is actually something quite new, and is something that again really asks the question of whether what is the effectiveness of those strikes, because then again, first of all, as we know, Venezuela is actually not producing any fentanyl, so there is actually no reason, if we look at what are the narco-trafficking, the anti-narcotics goals of Trump, also in terms of cocaine. I think I saw some statistic, 8% of all the cocaine that goes to the US comes from Venezuela. So clearly that's not the way to stop drugs coming into the US. And I think more in general, it's really the question that do we really, I mean, again, as I said, it's an expansion of this war on drugs, which clearly hasn't worked, because if we look at the number of, the cocaine production and coca production and cocaine production is actually is at record level after many decades of this kind of really just militarized approach. And I think really the question, especially since we are now really dealing with global conglomerates, right? Those organized crime groups are not anymore specialized on one market. They are actually now global, specialized in different markets. They can move from one market to the other. So really, I think the point is not really to the militarized approach itself is not going to be enough, because clearly there is, those groups are very flexible. They move from one market to the other. Fentanyl also is a drug that requires very little quantity, so it becomes even more difficult just to really go and look after the fentanyl quantity and all the labs that are in the world, because potentially I could do fentanyl in my kitchen, right? It's not something that requires a lot of know-how. So no, I'm not saying I'm doing fentanyl. I'm making fentanyl in my kitchen, but you get the sense. So so I think really now the strategy should be more about intelligence. Really try to to really work on what is on what more preventing than trying to seize the drugs. And it should also be very much into really going after the illicit flows, right? Because those are the way in which now we can actually go after cartels or groups which are basically in every single criminal economy and also illicit economy many times, because they're actually now more and more we see licit and illicit kind of combining in the portfolio of those groups. So I think to go to the question, there was a question on Mexico in that respect, and I think it's of course Mexico under the previous president was all about root causes of violence. Let's try to, which is also by the way very important, because multidimensional is the way in which you can actually address those issues. I think the current strategy in Mexico, it's in a way quite. Of course, you can argue that Trump has also forced a more kind of robust approach to cartels. But I think also what they're trying to do is using a lot more intelligence and a lot more going after what are the key revenue sources of the groups. So I think that's actually the way in which we should be going. And actually, there's a question on how important is international cooperation among what do we do against non-state armed groups in terms of international cooperation? And I think it is important. It becomes even more important the regional coordination or the international coordination and intelligence sharing. And I think that's the problem, because it seems that the way in which we are going is becoming more unilateral, especially surely in the region, where obviously the agenda of the US is much more is a bit of a negative agenda, not really positive. So in a way, I think cooperation is going to be more difficult. And I think we probably have time for no, we just asked. There was a question. There was no. Fine. Okay, perfect. So we can close on time. Thanks so much again. And the report is there are some copies of the report. There are some part of the report which are available online, and also there is some interactive data you'll find online. So thanks so much, and hope to see you next field. Bye.